You're watching Forsaken Joe. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy the story. Let's begin.
I leaned over the polished glass table, watching the board members' faces as I clicked through the slides. The project was perfect. Months of work, research, projections. I was proud of it, but they weren't. Not a single person seemed to care. Preston, my brother-in-law, was half smiling like a dog with a bone. Vanessa, my wife, wouldn't even look at me. She stared down at her lap like my existence was just too much to bear. I finished my pitch with the cost estimates and environmental benefits, but the room was silent. I knew what was coming. Preston dragged the cancellation papers from his folder and signed them with that slow, deliberate flair that made him look like a king condemning a peasant. "Charity case," he muttered, tossing the papers onto the table. His smugness twisted the knife, but just as he handed me the signed documents, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. It was the federal approval for the HUD grant I'd filed independently. I could barely stop myself from smiling. The deal was worth more than Weston's entire quarterly profits, bigger than anything Preston's empire had touched. I lifted my head, met his eyes, and let that smile out. "You just handed me your empire's coffin." I let the silence hang between us, the weight of my smile still fresh. Preston's face flickered with something close to frustration, but that wasn't what brought the rush of memories. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the floor beneath my feet like the last thing tethering me to reality. That's when I thought about how I ended up here in the first place. Married into the Weston family like a joke that no one ever bothered to laugh at. It wasn't always like that, of course. When Vanessa and I first got together, I thought maybe things would be different. I had a background in architecture, a deep understanding of design, and a genuine vision for the future of urban spaces. But none of that mattered when you were just Vanessa's husband. I pitched the Greenblock initiative 2 years ago. It was everything I believed in: eco-housing, solar panels, smart utility design, scalable urban renewal. I thought it was the future, and I thought they'd see that, too. But Preston just smirked when I brought it up, like I was a child with a crayon drawing, not a professional with a plan. "Vanessa?" She laughed outright. "You want to build what, exactly? Tiny houses for the homeless? That's adorable." The sting of her words stayed with me, but it was the way Preston looked at me that hurt most. He wasn't just dismissive, he was cruel. He loved to remind me how out of my depth I was, and how I was just Vanessa's pet project. Like I was some charity case they allowed in, a good-looking fool who got a seat at the table by accident. At that fundraiser, the one where everyone in the family and the company gathered, I pitched Greenblock again. Same idea, same slides. But this time, Preston took the mic and called me out in front of everyone. "Meet the guy who draws tiny houses," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "While the rest of us are making deals that change cities, he's off dreaming about a little eco-village for his friends." The laughter was sharp. Vanessa, standing at the edge of the room, didn't even flinch. I thought about how they'd all looked at me in that moment, like I was nothing, a joke to laugh at, like I had no place in their world. But there's something about being underestimated. It fuels you. I remember the night I came home after that fundraiser. Vanessa barely spoke to me, already lost in her own world, like she always was. I couldn't shake the anger, though, the humiliation. So I did what any sane person would do. I bought an abandoned lot in South Phoenix with the last of my savings. It was a stretch, but I had a feeling about the place. And I didn't tell anyone, not even Vanessa. I built the prototype in secret, piece by piece. I used my late father's police pension, the small check that came every month since his passing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover supplies and permits. I remember the first day I stood on that lot, looking at the skeleton of what would become the Greenblock prototype. I started with a small structure, a tiny house, sure, but not in the way they'd mocked it. This one was solar-powered, built with reclaimed materials, with a water filtration system and energy-efficient appliances. When it started to take shape, people would drive by and stare. Some stopped to ask questions. Most just shook their heads. "You really think this is going to work?" one guy asked. "This is going to be a waste of time." But I didn't care. I kept going. I documented every step, every measurement, every choice, every obstacle I faced. I was going to show them. Show all of them. I wasn't some clueless husband playing at being an architect. I was a man with a plan, and soon enough, they'd all see what I could do. I let the room settle, watching as Preston's grin started to twitch. He was still clinging to that fantasy where he controlled everything, where he got to be the king. The documents in my hand, though, felt like a weight in the air between us. The land deed, the HUD grant approval, my LLC's exclusive rights, all of it. It was real. I slid everything across the table toward him, watching his face as he looked down at the stack. His fingers twitched. First, he reached for the land deed, then the grant award. His eyes darted from one to the other, back to the deed, like maybe, just maybe, the paperwork was a mistake. But it wasn't. I funded it, I said quietly, my voice the only thing that broke the tension. I filed the zoning myself. All of it's in my name, Preston, not Weston Properties. Mine. Preston's face went pale. For the first time, I saw him stumble, genuinely caught off guard. His mouth worked, but no words came out. He looked at the board, like maybe they'd give him an out. But the board was staring at him now, and I could feel the shift in the room. I leaned forward, letting the silence settle. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner, buzzing through the tense air. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice dripping with that trademark sneer. So what now? Her eyes flicked toward me, a challenge in her tone. What's your big move, genius? You gonna build your little houses in the desert? I didn't even glance at her. Instead, I slid my phone across the table, tapping it once to open the emails. The subject lines alone were enough to tell all of them, that this wasn't some pipe dream I was hanging on to. I watched as her gaze dropped to the screen. The names of HUD, the EPA, and several private equity firms lit up in rapid succession. The bids were coming in. I didn't have to say a word. Vanessa's expression twisted, the sneer replaced by something darker, frustration. Fear. You just signed away billions, I said, watching her eyes flicker, trying to process. The whole room went dead silent. I could hear the faint rustling of papers, the low hum of the air conditioning, the quick shuffle of someone shifting in their chair, but no one spoke. They didn't have to. The reality of the situation was clear now. Preston had just signed his own death sentence, and the board saw it. Vanessa saw it. Preston was shaking his head now, his lips thin with disbelief. This isn't possible, he muttered, almost to himself. But it wasn't a question. It was a plea. He had no idea how deep he'd just buried himself. Actually, it is, I said, barely hiding the satisfaction. I looked around the table, seeing the mix of shock and dawning comprehension on their faces. All of them had thought Preston was untouchable. And now, they were starting to understand who really owned the future of this project. I let the silence sit there for a moment longer, watching as they all realized the same thing. I had what they didn't. And for once, I wasn't going to be the one they overlooked. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom with Raoul at my side. The tension was thicker than ever, like someone had pulled a heavy, suffocating blanket over the place. Preston was at the head of the table, but he wasn't looking too confident anymore. His usual cocky smirk was gone, replaced with a tight jaw and eyes darting nervously around the room. He was trying to rally the board, talking fast, almost desperate, like if he talked long enough, they might forget the mess he'd just made. But the board wasn't listening. They were already spooked. They'd seen the paperwork. They'd seen the emails. Preston's game was over, and they knew it. Raoul was calm, as usual. He had that presence, the kind of quiet authority that made people sit up and pay attention. He slid a folder across the table toward Preston, letting the pages inside settle with a soft thud. I could feel everyone's eyes on us now, the weight of the moment pressing down on the room. Clause 14b, Raoul said, his voice steady but sharp. It's right here in Weston Properties Charter. Any attempt to transfer control of a private development automatically invalidates voting shares. Since Preston signed those transfer documents for a property he didn't own, that clause has triggered. Shares default to the builder. The room froze. The air felt still, like everything had gone silent, even though the hum of the AC kept going in the background. I could see the moment the realization hit Preston, the color drained from his face. Raoul's words echoed in the room, and I watched the board's expressions shift. This wasn't just a legal argument. This was a death sentence for everything Preston had built. I leaned forward, enjoying the silence before speaking again. Which means, I said slowly, I'm the majority shareholder now. Preston's face twisted with anger. His fists clenched on the table, knuckles white, and he shot to his feet. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and disbelief. You can't take my company. Roll didn't flinch. "It's done," he said, the words cold and final. "The clause triggered as soon as you signed the transfer documents. This isn't just about paperwork, it's company policy. You lost control the moment you decided to make a deal on land you didn't own." Vanessa didn't take it well either. She crossed her arms, her face contorting with disgust as she glared at me. "This is a mistake," she spat, stepping forward. "You can't just take everything from us. You've always been nothing but a joke, my joke." I didn't blink. I didn't even flinch. Her words were nothing new, but this time, they didn't sting. They were just noise. "You think I'm a joke?" I said, my voice hardening. "Maybe you should have paid attention when I told you I wasn't a damn charity case. I'm not the guy who draws tiny houses anymore, Vanessa. I'm the one who owns them now." Her eyes burned with fury, but she couldn't say a word. Preston, though, was still yelling. "I'll fight this. I'll have you thrown out, I'll." Roll raised a hand, cutting him off. "You can fight all you want, Preston, but the legal reality is simple. You signed away control. And now, Weston Properties doesn't belong to you anymore." I stood up, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. I looked at the board members, some still in shock, others just trying to process it all. "This is my project now," I said, letting the finality of it sink in. "I built it. I funded it. I'm the one making the deals. You want to be part of this? Fine. But it's my terms now. I'm not here to play games with your egos." The room was dead silent, but in that silence, I could hear Preston's frustration boiling over. I could see the realization on his face. Everything he thought he owned was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Roll stepped back, nodding slightly at me, like everything had already been decided, because it had. Vanessa stood there for a moment, seething, but she knew better than to make a scene. She wasn't in control anymore. None of them were. I looked at Preston one last time, and it felt like the end of an era. "Enjoy your last few minutes of control," I said. "The rest is mine." I pulled up the file on my laptop and hit play, feeling a strange calm wash over me. I'd been sitting on this for months, collecting everything I needed, every piece of evidence, every tiny slip-up they made. Vanessa's face flickered on the screen. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to be exposed. The video started with surveillance footage from inside the company. Vanessa, sitting in her office late one night, transferring money into an account with a name that wasn't even hers. It wasn't subtle. She thought no one would notice, but I had the files, the timestamps, and the receipts. Raoul spoke up, his voice like ice cutting through the tension. "This is just the beginning." I clicked through the slides. First, financial logs. Vanessa had been siphoning off company funds, using them to buy votes on the board. The numbers were glaring, the transfers blatant. Anyone who looked at this would see it for what it was. Then came the internal memos. Emails between Vanessa and several of the board members, discussing how to rig the next vote, how to keep Preston in power long enough to keep the cash flowing. There were emails with specific instructions on how to forge approval signatures for projects they knew would fail, but they didn't care, as long as the money kept moving. I clicked again. This time, it was about the plans. Vanessa had forged 3 separate sets of plans for major projects. Not only did she redirect permits for buildings they never intended to construct, but she'd also sold trade secrets to a rival developer. The evidence was damning. I could feel the room tightening around us. Vanessa's breath quickened as she watched the screen, her face turning a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice came out trembling, not with fear, but with that familiar edge of entitlement. "This is all a lie," she snapped, her hands slamming down on the table. "You're twisting things, making me look like a criminal." She tried to play victim, like she always did, but it wasn't going to work this time. I wasn't the naive guy who married her out of love anymore. I wasn't some pawn in her game. Raoul stayed calm, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's not a lie, Vanessa. It's all in the files. And the FBI's already investigating." The words hit like a bullet. Vanessa went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She didn't expect that. None of them did. Preston's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping the floor like a knife. His eyes darted from Vanessa to the board and then back to the screen, trying to make sense of it. He looked like he was about to collapse. "You're lying," he choked out, his voice barely audible. This is all just bullshit." Raoul didn't move. He just let the silence hang. I'm not lying, I said, voice low, steady. But I don't think it's going to matter much longer. Because once the FBI's done, you two won't have a damn thing left. Vanessa's hand flew up, and she tried to interject, but she was too shaken to be convincing. You can't do this. You can't ruin me like this. I'll destroy you if I have to. Her threats were weak. Pathetic. She'd never been in a real fight. Not like this. I wasn't scared of her anymore. Raoul stepped in, his tone unflinching. You're done, Vanessa. The evidence is clear, and the investigation's already underway. You don't have the power to stop this. Preston's face was unreadable now. His mouth hung open slightly, eyes wide, as the weight of the situation hit him. I could almost see the gears turning in his head. This wasn't a business problem anymore. This was life and death for everything he'd built. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to save it. He took a step back, his legs shaking. This isn't over, he muttered, though there was no conviction behind it. We'll fight this. I won't go down like this. But it was too late. His words were empty. The damage had already been done. Vanessa glared at me, her eyes filled with venom. But there was a tremor there, too. She knew she was done. She knew the fight was over. We'll see who wins in the end, she hissed. But there was no fight in her anymore. She knew, deep down, I was the one walking out of this room with everything. I leaned back in my chair, watching her, watching Preston. The room felt colder now, like all the air had been sucked out of it. I didn't need to say anything else. They knew what was coming, and it was going to be ugly. But for me, it was the beginning of something new. I clicked to the next slide, my fingers still hovering over the mouse. The board was still in shock, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This wasn't just about a takeover. This was about cleaning up the mess they'd made. About putting names to the faces they'd stepped on to get where they were. And now, those faces were mine. The next slide came up, a list. Names, dates, job titles. The former architects and engineers Preston and Vanessa had driven out. People they discarded when they became inconvenient. I leaned in, letting the silence linger. I didn't need to say much. Just let the weight of it hang in the air. These are the people you destroyed, I said, voice steady, like I was reading a list of dead soldiers. Each one of them was an architect, an engineer, a designer who was pushed out because they were too good for you two. I clicked again, revealing the evidence to back it up. There were whistleblower emails, termination papers that had been falsified, and NDAs signed under duress. All things Vanessa and Preston had thought they could hide, but they never counted on me finding them. Raoul didn't say anything, but I could see his eyes flickering over the screen, taking it all in. He already knew how this was going to end. I called out the first name, Andrea Lawson, a senior architect who had been one of the first to call out the asbestos cover-ups at one of their developments. Vanessa had blacklisted her, ensuring she couldn't work for anyone else in the industry. Andrea was one of the good ones, someone who actually cared about the buildings they put up, the people who would live in them. Vanessa made sure Andrea's career was ruined for trying to save lives, I said, letting the words hang in the air. But she didn't just ruin Andrea. She ruined a lot of people. I moved to the next name. This one hitting Preston harder than he expected. Ethan Perez, an engineer who designed water filtration systems that could have saved thousands in underserved communities. But Preston didn't want that kind of innovation. He wanted the easy, profitable designs. So he had Ethan pushed out. Ethan's system? Gone. Never built. Instead, they used cheap alternatives that failed. I could see Preston's jaw tighten as I moved down the list. He wasn't used to hearing this kind of thing. It wasn't just numbers and profits anymore. These were real people who'd been crushed under his and Vanessa's feet. I went on. Carla Hernandez, Darren Jacobs, Lori King, all pushed out for similar reasons, all now working for me. They were part of Greenblock now, the very people who built it from the ground up, and they were better for it. They had the integrity, the vision, and the drive that Weston Properties had lacked for so long. I could see the board squirming. They were listening now, really listening. This wasn't just a corporate takeover. This was a reckoning. People like Vanessa and Preston thought they could silence voices, ruin careers, and still walk around with their heads held high. But I had those voices now, and those voices were louder than anything they could ever say. I looked directly at Preston, letting the silence settle before I spoke again. You stole designs from people who cared, rebranded them as your own, and sold them as the next big thing. You took their work, their ideas, their futures, and you turned them into your own little empire. Preston was sweating now, his hands trembling slightly on the edge of the table. He was broken. You could see it in the way his shoulders slumped. All the arrogance was gone. "You can't do this," he whispered, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "You can't just—" I raised a hand to stop him. "I can. And I just did. All those names you tried to bury? They're with me now. You don't control this anymore. You never did." Vanessa was standing now, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't sneering anymore. She wasn't even making eye contact. She was processing, like the weight of everything I'd just said was sinking in. "Is this how you want to go down, Vanessa?" I asked, watching her closely. "Is this the legacy you want to leave? Destroying lives to keep yourself in power?" Her lips pressed tight, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. The room had gone completely still, save for the hum of the lights overhead. Everyone was processing the same thing. The faces of all the people they'd discarded, the ones who were better off now without Weston Properties. And they were all here, under me now. They had a new home. I let the room settle for a moment, letting them feel the weight of everything that had just been laid bare. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about something bigger, a reckoning, a true rebuilding. "This is your legacy," I said, letting the finality of it settle in their minds. "A legacy of broken careers, stolen ideas, and corruption. And now, it's mine to fix." I let the room sit in silence for a moment, watching as the weight of everything I'd just laid out settled on the board. Their faces were all different, but they were united in one thing: shock. They had no idea what was coming next. But I did. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the Greenblock Hub, a fully functional, self-sustaining micro-community under construction in South Phoenix. The pictures flickered to life on the screen, showing rows of homes with solar roofing, smart grids, and recycled materials. The designs were sleek, efficient, modern, everything Vanessa and Preston had mocked as too idealistic, too small, or unrealistic. But the plans? The plans were real. I heard one of the board members murmur, This is live, right?" I nodded. "It is." I clicked again, and a detailed map of the community flashed across the screen, showing its layout. The homes were part of a broader vision, a fully integrated smart city, powered by AI-driven grid balancing that ensured energy efficiency, waste management, and sustainable water use. Everything worked together: the homes, the solar panels, the community gardens. A closed-loop system, with zero waste and energy independence. The room was quiet now, the board members staring at the screen in disbelief. One of them spoke up, voice tentative. "HUD, they've already approved this?" I didn't need to answer. The HUD reps had already toured the site last week, but I let the silence stretch a little longer before I finally spoke. "Yes, they've signed off on it. They're already considering expansion." I clicked again, showing the letters of approval, the funding, the investors lined up. Vanessa, who had been standing across the room, arms crossed tightly, was now staring at the screen with wide eyes. She wasn't sneering anymore. She wasn't mocking me. She was processing, and it looked like it was finally hitting her. "You know," I said, barely looking at her, "I remember you laughing at my tiny office." I let the word tiny hang in the air. Turns out I wasn't just sitting there with my head in the clouds. I was overseeing the development of a fully functional smart city model. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that sink in. Preston had been quiet, his eyes flicking between the board and the screen. But now, his voice broke through the tension, barely audible but filled with disbelief. "How did you do all this?" His voice cracked slightly, like a man who had just realized his entire empire was built on a foundation of sand. I didn't even have to think about my response. I'd been waiting for that question. "You never paid attention," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "That was your mistake." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, trying to process what I'd said. But there was no processing it anymore. He had no leverage, no tricks left. The foundation of Weston Properties had cracked wide open, and I was standing right in the middle of it, with everything in my hands. The board was still stunned. The kind of shocked silence that comes when you realize you've been played. I watched their eyes shift, their faces going from confusion to horror as they realized they'd been working for the wrong side. And in that moment, I knew. I knew this wasn't just about taking over a company. It was about proving something bigger. about showing that real change wasn't some far-off dream. It was here, in the communities we built, in the people we empowered, in the systems we put in place. I clicked again, bringing up the final image, a rendering of the community once it was complete, vibrant, green, sustainable. The kind of place where people could live without worrying about whether they'd be priced out or pushed aside. This is the future, I said, letting my voice carry. This is what I've been building while you two played games with people's lives. Vanessa's face twisted, but she didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Preston just stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. He wasn't the king anymore. He wasn't even a player. He was a spectator now, and it was my turn to take the stage. I let the silence linger for a while longer, feeling the tension in the room shift. This wasn't just about winning anymore. This was about creating something real, something that would outlast them all. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had everything in my corner. The next morning, as I sat at my desk, scanning the contracts that were pouring in for Greenblock, I didn't expect anyone to walk in. Certainly not her. But then the door opened, and there she was, Margaret Weston, Vanessa's mother. I almost didn't recognize her at first. No designer jewelry, no air of superiority. Just a woman in her late 60s, wearing a simple gray sweater and a look that was uncertain. She stepped in quietly, eyes downcast as she crossed the threshold. There was no fanfare, no grand entrance. She wasn't the woman I remembered, the one who'd always seemed so polished, so in control. She looked tired, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit broken. I didn't say anything at first. I just waited, watching her as she slowly made her way to the chair across from my desk. She didn't sit down immediately, though. Instead, she stood there, shifting the weight from one foot to the other like she was trying to figure out where to start. Finally, she spoke. I wanted to apologize. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, softer, like she was the one now trying to make peace. She wasn't the powerful matriarch of Weston Properties anymore. She wasn't even the woman who used to scold me for not fitting into the family. She was just a person. You were right, she said, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. I saw what was happening, but I stayed quiet. I thought maybe it was just how things worked. She shook her head slightly, almost to herself. I didn't want to get involved. I should have spoken up. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure what to say. I had my reasons for not caring about her apologies, but as she stood there, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before, it made me feel like this was bigger than I thought. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, a thin manila envelope that looked worn, the corners bent from handling. I should have done this years ago, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm doing it now. She slid the folder across the desk to me. I glanced down at the folder, then back up at her, confused. But I opened it, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Inside were the early sketches I'd given to Preston years ago, the ones I'd drawn for Greenblock when I first pitched the idea, the ones Preston had dismissed, shoved away like they were nothing more than a scribbled dream. But here they were, in Margaret's hands. She had kept them all this time. Preston kept them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He hid them in his drawer. She seemed to choke on the words, almost like she couldn't believe it herself. He never saw what you could really do. None of us did. I looked at the sketches again, seeing them through a different lens. These weren't just lines on paper anymore. They were the foundation of something real, something that was already taking shape in South Phoenix. Margaret reached across the desk, her hand trembling slightly, and placed another piece of paper in front of me. It was a legal document. I want to back you, she said, her eyes meeting mine again, this time more firmly. I want to fund the Greenblock Foundation. My father left me his estate trust. I want to use it to help fund minds like yours, the ones who get ignored. She was offering me everything, the funding, the legitimacy, the support that I needed to turn Greenblock into something even bigger than I had dreamed. Something that could truly change the future of urban living. I didn't hesitate. This wasn't a decision I had to think about. I'd been waiting for this moment, even if I hadn't realized it until now. I accept, I said, the words solidifying the shift that had been happening for months now. This is exactly what I've been looking for. Margaret's face softened, a relief I hadn't expected crossing her features. It was a small, quiet thing, but in that moment, I saw her in a new light. She wasn't just Vanessa's mother anymore. She was someone who, in her own way, was trying to right a wrong. And that meant something. She gave me a nod, then stood up, pausing before she left the room. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I believe in what you're doing. I always did. I just never saw it. Not until now." I watched her leave, and for the first time, it felt like something was finally coming full circle. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about creating something new, something that could outlast all the bullshit, all the power plays, all the egos. As Margaret stepped out of the door, leaving me with the folder, I knew that this was just the beginning. The foundation was set. The future was wide open. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone stand in my way. 1 month later, the old Weston HQ didn't look anything like the building I'd walked into just a few weeks ago. The polished, stuffy corporate feel had been replaced with open floor plans and collaborative design studios. Bright, airy spaces filled with natural light, green plants lining the windowsills. The place felt alive in a way it never had before. I was standing in the center of the new innovation hub when I saw it. The live feed dashboards flashing on the wall, showing energy consumption, water recapture, and environmental data for our pilot neighborhoods. It was like watching a dream unfold in real time. Every number, every graph was a reminder of what we were building. A sustainable future, a new kind of urban living that people were starting to believe in. Formerly disgraced engineers, the ones Vanessa and Preston had pushed out, were now leading divisions. It felt good to see them in charge, directing teams, implementing the very systems they designed but never been allowed to run with. Ethan Perez was standing by the dashboard, pointing out the water recapture systems being installed in pilot neighborhoods. The systems weren't just innovative, they were working, providing thousands of gallons of purified water every day. "This is exactly what we needed," Ethan said, tapping a few buttons on the dashboard. The data was clear. The system was saving more than we'd even projected. "You gave us the chance to prove it, and we've done it." I smiled, but it was more than pride. It was validation. They weren't the failures they'd been told they were. They were the future. I turned my attention back to the project, but my phone buzzed in my pocket, interrupting my thoughts. It was a quick message from one of my HUD contacts. City Council just greenlit the Greenblock expansion. The approval had been weeks in the making, but now it was official. The city was on board. Phoenix was about to see an entirely new model of development, and it wasn't coming from Weston Properties. It was coming from me. I couldn't help the smile that tugged at my lips. I was used to the game by now, but this felt different. This wasn't about money or power. This was about changing lives. A knock on the door caught my attention. Raoul stepped inside, holding a folder in one hand. He looked pleased, but there was something else in his expression too. The weight of something big, something undeniable. "Greenblock's value just skyrocketed," he said, a small grin forming. "We just hit a record high on the stock exchange. And not just here, either. HUD, Google Urban Systems, even international governments are reaching out. They want in." I stared at him for a second, processing the news. It wasn't just that Greenblock was expanding. It was that the whole world was starting to notice. Raoul leaned back, crossing his arms. "It's all yours, you know. Everything you've built, everything you've fought for, it's happening." But it wasn't just mine. It was the team's. Ethan, Andrea, Carla, Lori, all of them, leading the charge. They were the ones who were making it happen. Without them, none of this would be possible. "Yeah," I said, still trying to wrap my mind around it. But I wouldn't be here without them. We didn't have time to celebrate, though. I had a meeting with the city council later that afternoon to discuss the expansion plans. But as I turned back to the dashboard, watching the energy grid update in real time, it was hard not to think about how far we'd come. From the wreckage of Weston Properties to this moment. We were building more than just houses. We were building a future. I thought about the day Vanessa had called my project a tiny house joke. The same project that now had more value than Weston's entire portfolio. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked out of the room, past the newly designed offices and down the hall to my own. It was bigger now, more open, with a view of the city. The skyline outside was changing, and not just because of the new buildings going up, but because of the foundation we were laying for something better, something real. As I sat down at my desk, I felt it. The weight of the world, the weight of every person who'd been left behind by Weston Properties, pressing against my chest. But now, I wasn't alone in carrying it. I had a team. I had a purpose. And the city, the world, was starting to take notice. Vanessa pled guilty to fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction. 18 years. It wasn't a surprise. Everyone knew she was guilty. Even she knew it, though she tried to hold on to some shred of pride throughout the trial. I watched her in court, her head lowered, her fingers twitching at her side. There was nothing left to say. No more excuses. The sentence was a result of her own choices. Preston's fate was different. Quiet. Muted. He retired shortly after, with a small severance and a quiet departure that would have gone unnoticed if the media hadn't caught wind of it. His name was scrubbed from every company plaque, from every board meeting, from the history of Weston Properties itself. And for all his bluster, for all the shouting and the griping about losing control, Preston never fought back. Not really. He didn't have the stomach for it. Not when he saw that his empire had crumbled and his name meant nothing anymore. Not when it was clear that he'd been nothing more than a puppet in his own play. I stood in the office he once called his command tower, the place he ruled over with an iron fist, the space where he once thought he held all the power. Now it was a community design lab, full of blueprints and tech, ideas and energy. It felt right. It felt like we were building something that mattered. The city skyline outside the window reflected the changes, too. Solar panels on rooftops, sleek steel towers rising from the ground, a grid that wasn't just about commerce, but about living, about sustainability. The city was growing, but in a way that had nothing to do with greed. Press had caught on to the shift. They were calling me the silent architect, the man who had flipped a corrupt empire without ever throwing a single punch. It wasn't revenge. It was something more, something that felt bigger than I ever expected. I leaned against the desk, taking a long look at the view, at the city, at the foundation we were building. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It had never been. Revenge was a fire that burned itself out. But what we were doing here, what Greenblock was becoming, that was something different. It was a legacy where talent rises, where people who have something real to offer, people who care, finally have the chance to be heard, where power doesn't mean corruption, but the opportunity to make things better for everyone. And the skyline outside, with its solar panels and smart grids, reflected that change. Solar, steel, and second chances. I smiled to myself. This wasn't about what I had taken from them. This was about what we were building together.